He left his wife thinking she was barren, but one day, while having dinner with a new girlfriend, he saw her pregnant and working as a waitress. Write in the comments what you would do if you were the characters. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. The warm scent of coffee and freshly baked bread still lingered in the air as Emma stood by the kitchen window, watching the soft drizzle paint the glass with winding trails. The sound of the city outside, distant sirens, muffled chatter, the rhythmic hum of life, felt like a world away. Inside, silence had taken residence, heavy and stifling, a companion she hadn't invited. Her hands clutched a ceramic mug, the heat seeping into her palms, but doing little to warm the cold ache inside her chest. She hadn't slept properly in weeks. The couch had become her bed, the creases in the cushions permanent from restless nights. Their bedroom upstairs, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and love, now felt like a mausoleum, echoing with memories that cut deeper than she cared to admit. Emma's gaze flickered to the small collection of framed photographs on the shelf. Her fingers itched to touch them, but she stopped herself. There they were, her and Leo, all wide smiles and eyes filled with promise. The honeymoon in Italy, the summer road trip through the mountains, the silly snapshots from rainy days spent dancing barefoot in the park. Back when love felt invincible, but cracks had formed and she hadn't seen them until it was too late. Or maybe she had. Maybe she'd been too afraid to confront them. Leo. His name felt like a whisper and a scream all at once. The last argument still rang in her ears, sharp and raw. She could remember his voice, strained and bitter, the anger barely masking something else. Fear, exhaustion, something she couldn't reach. "You don't get it, Emma," he had shouted, his hands gripping the back of the dining chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. "It's not just about us. It's everything. The pressure, the expectations. I can't breathe." Her voice had been cold, though her heart had been burning. "So, what then? You run? You leave because life isn't perfect?" His silence had been the worst answer of all. She had expected him to fight. She had wanted him to, but he hadn't. Instead, he had gone upstairs, the sound of a suitcase zipper cutting through the quiet like a razor. She didn't remember what she said as he passed her by the door, his eyes dark and distant, a storm she couldn't navigate. And then he was gone. That was 2 months ago. No calls, no messages, nothing but absence, cold and complete. The first days were a blur of tears and unanswered questions. She had paced the apartment like a ghost, screaming his name into the void, demanding answers from the walls. She had checked her phone obsessively until the silence became a weight she could no longer bear. Friends had come. They brought pity and hollow comfort. "He just needs time," they said. Or worse, "Maybe it's for the best." She hated them for those words. They didn't understand. But time marched on, merciless and cold. The rent notice came, the bank statements too, their shared account frozen without warning. Emma quickly learned that heartbreak didn't pause for bills. And then the sickness started. Morning after morning, waves of nausea that left her doubled over, trembling and empty. She thought it was the stress, her body's rebellion against grief. Until the test. 2 pink lines. Her knees had given out beneath her, the bathroom floor cold and unfeeling against her skin. Leo's child. A sob had torn from her throat, too full of conflicting emotions to name. Joy, terror, hope, loss. She had reached for her phone, his number already burning on the screen, but her thumb hovered over the call button, and something heavy settled in her chest. No, he had made his choice. He had left. And she would survive. But survival was not easy. The job market was ruthless. Her resume, though solid, brought rejection after rejection. Too much experience for entry level, not enough for managerial. The interviews were exhausting, her savings dwindling. Desperation led her to the restaurant, a mid-range spot downtown with long hours and demanding customers. The pay was poor, the tips unpredictable, but it was something. And something was all she had. The shifts were grueling. On her feet for 12 hours, balancing trays, dodging impatient customers, swallowing insults with a forced smile. Her body ached, her back protesting the strain of carrying both the trays and the growing life inside her. The uniform stretched tight over her swelling belly, a reminder that she didn't have the luxury to slow down. Every time she felt the flutter of tiny kicks inside her, she would whisper, "We've got this, baby. Just a little longer." But the nights were the hardest. Alone in the cold apartment, her hands resting protectively over her stomach, she felt the sharp edges of Leo's absence the most. She missed his voice, his warmth, the way he used to trace lazy circles on her back as they drifted to sleep. Yet the anger smoldered too. How dare he leave? How dare he walk away from her, from them, without a word? Emma fought every day to keep herself afloat, and with every battle she felt herself growing harder, colder. The woman Leo had left behind was gone. In her place stood someone forged from heartbreak and necessity, but beneath the steel a fragile ember of hope remained. Hope that he would come back. Hope that he would care. Hope that he would see the life he had turned his back on. But hope was a dangerous thing, and Emma had already learned how it could break you. That night, as she curled up on the couch, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, she felt a kick, strong and certain. Her lips trembled as she whispered into the silence, "It's just us now, little one, but we're going to be okay." In the distance, thunder rolled, a soft warning on the wind, and Emma closed her eyes, bracing for the storm. The sky was a dull slate gray, the kind of color that pressed down on the city and made everything feel heavier. Emma wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric already stained from the dinner rush, and inhaled deeply through her nose. The aroma of garlic, seared meat, and fresh herbs should have been comforting, but to her it smelled like exhaustion. She had been on her feet for nearly 10 hours, and the ache in her back had settled into something permanent, a dull companion that no amount of stretching could relieve. The soft, rhythmic pulse of her baby's movements was the only warmth she felt. She paused for a moment, pressing a hand to her rounded belly beneath the apron, whispering softly, "You're being a little gymnast tonight, huh?" The baby kicked in response, and a faint, tired smile ghosted across her lips. The kitchen doors swung open, and her manager's voice cut through the clatter of dishes and the hiss of pans. "Emma, table 9. They're already complaining about the wait." Emma straightened, swallowing the sharp retort that threatened to escape. "On it," she replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. Her ankles throbbed with every step as she weaved through the tightly packed tables. The restaurant was alive with conversation, laughter, and the occasional clash of glassware. Couples leaned in close, friends toasted to promotions or birthdays, reminders of a world Emma felt she no longer belonged to. At table 9, a man in a crisp suit barely glanced up from his phone. His companion, a woman with a perfectly curated smile, tapped her manicured nails on the tabletop impatiently. "It's about time," the woman said, her tone dripping with irritation. "We ordered sparkling, not still." Emma's fingers curled tightly around the tray. "I'll fix that right away. Apologies for the mix-up." The man didn't even acknowledge her, engrossed in whatever deal or distraction glowed from his screen. Emma turned swiftly, her breath tight, and hurried back to the bar to exchange the bottle. As she waited, she overheard fragments of a nearby conversation. Something about a friend's new baby, the joy of their first steps. The words twisted inside her chest and she quickly refocused on the bottle in front of her, gripping it harder than necessary. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of orders, complaints, and aching muscles. By the time she hung up her apron in the cramped employee locker room, the clock read well past midnight. She felt the exhaustion like a physical weight, pulling her shoulders down and blurring the edges of her vision. The walk home was cold and quiet. The city, once alive with chaos, had settled into a muffled hum. Emma's breath puffed out in soft clouds as she pulled her coat tighter around her belly. She hated walking home alone this late, but taxis were a luxury she couldn't afford. Her apartment greeted her with silence and shadows. The heater rattled, barely pushing warmth into the room. She dropped her bag and slid out of her shoes, biting back a groan as her swollen feet touched the cold floor. Collapsing onto the worn couch, Emma rubbed her belly in slow, comforting circles. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with fatigue. "I know this isn't how I wanted it to be, but I promise you, I'm going to make this work." The baby kicked, a small, steady rhythm against her palm. It felt like agreement, or maybe encouragement, but the tears still came. Silent and hot, they traced down her cheeks as she curled into herself, the weight of everything pressing down until she felt she might break. The days became a relentless cycle of labor and loneliness. Emma learned to endure the judgment in strangers' eyes, the sideways glances at her belly, the silent questions they didn't dare voice. She felt it from customers, from neighbors, from people on the street. The whispers at work were the worst. "Did you hear? She's pregnant, but no ring." "I bet the dad bailed." Typical. "She's going to pop any day, and she's still working doubles?" Desperate. Emma felt every word like a knife, but she never let them see her flinch. She had no room for their pity, no time for their assumptions. Her only focus was survival. She picked up extra shifts, staying late until her legs felt like they might give out. When the rent notice came, bold red letters threatening eviction, she sold her engagement ring. The band that had once symbolized forever now bought her one more month under the same roof. She stopped buying anything but essentials. Dinners became ramen and peanut butter sandwiches. Her only indulgence was prenatal vitamins, because the baby at least deserved that much. Nights were the hardest. The apartment, once filled with laughter and shared dreams, now felt like a hollow shell. The bed, their bed, remained untouched. She slept on the couch because the memories of Leo in their bedroom were too loud, too heavy. But if there was one thing she refused to surrender, it was hope. The first time she felt the baby hiccup, it was after a brutal double shift. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the couch, too exhausted to make it those last few steps to bed. And then, fluttering, rhythmic little pulses, soft and insistent. A laugh bubbled up through her tears, startled and raw. "What are you doing in there, little one?" she murmured, her fingers tracing the curve of her stomach. "Having a party without me?" That night, she slept without nightmares for the first time in weeks. The weeks blurred together, marked only by the slow expansion of her belly and the deepening ache in her bones. The work didn't get easier. If anything, it became harder. Customers grew ruder, their impatience sharper as the holiday season approached. The final blow came one icy evening. The dinner rush had ended, and Emma was cleaning a spill near the bar when a customer, a man, loud and belligerent from too many drinks, lost his patience. "What's taking so damn long?" he barked, his face flushed and his words slurred. "What, can't waddle any faster?" Emma froze, her entire body stiffening. She straightened slowly, her back screaming in protest. "I'm doing my best, sir," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained exhaustion. But he wasn't finished. "Figures. Probably why you're in this mess to begin with. Bet the daddy ran off, huh?" The glass in her hand shattered. She hadn't meant to grip it that hard, but it splintered in her palm, the sudden sting of pain almost a relief compared to the burn in her chest. The restaurant went silent. The man's smirk faltered. Emma stared at her bleeding hand, then back at him. She felt the weight of every sleepless night, every whispered judgment, every moment of fear and isolation, and suddenly she was too tired to care. Without a word, she turned on her heel and marched to the back. The manager found her in the employee restroom, her hands trembling as she ran cold water over the cuts. "You okay?" he asked gruffly, his voice softer than usual. Emma's throat felt tight, but she managed to nod. "Fine." He handed her a towel. "Take the rest of the night off. Get that looked at." She hesitated. "I can't afford—" He cut her off with a wave. "It's covered. Don't argue." The sudden kindness unraveled her more than any cruelty could have. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. That night, Emma sat on her couch with her bandaged hand resting protectively over her belly. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark window, tired, worn, but unbroken. "We're going to be okay," she said softly to her child. "I don't know how yet, but we will." The baby's tiny movement felt like a promise. But promises and perseverance couldn't change the cruel turns of fate. And fate had one more test in store, one that would bring her past crashing back into her present. And with it, the man she had fought so hard to forget. The December wind bit through the cracks of the restaurant's front door, swirling in with each new customer and leaving a trail of cold against the tiled floor. Emma felt every draft as it slipped beneath her thin uniform, a shiver rippling up her spine. She barely registered it. The exhaustion in her bones was a deeper cold, one that no heater could fix. Her shift had started hours ago, but time blurred in the familiar chaos of ringing orders, clattering plates, and the hiss of steam from the kitchen. The dinner crowd was in full swing, business people shaking off their day with cocktails, couples sharing candlelit plates, and groups of friends laughing over shared appetizers. The chatter was a roar, and Emma moved through it on autopilot, her tray balanced with the grace of a tightrope walker. Her belly was heavier now, the baby's kicks more insistent. At times, they stole her breath mid-order, forcing her to pause and place a steadying hand on her side. She had learned to smile through it, to joke with customers. Guess they're excited for the special tonight. It earned her a few polite chuckles, a few extra tips from the kind ones, but mostly it earned her nothing but stares. She felt their eyes, the assumptions behind them. She'd grown used to it. The quick flicker from her face to her stomach and back again. The unspoken stories they wrote for her. Poor girl, knocked up and alone. Or worse, must be her fault. But none of it mattered. She didn't live for their stories. She lived for the life inside her. The door chimed. Another couple swept in with the winter wind, their laughter bright and effortless. Emma, balancing a tray of drinks, barely glanced their way, until she heard the voice. A voice that had once felt like home. "Two, please. Near the window if you have it." The world narrowed. The tray, the noise, the crowd, it all faded into a low hum, a heartbeat beneath the sharp, sudden crash of her own pulse. Her eyes lifted, and there he was, Leo. Her heart stopped, then stumbled into a painful sprint. Her fingers clenched around the tray, knuckles whitening, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She stood frozen, the air solidifying around her as if the universe itself wanted to trap her in this moment. He hadn't seen her yet, but she saw him. And worse, she saw her. The woman at his side was everything Emma felt she no longer was, polished, poised, and effortless. A sleek dress hugged her figure, a coat that screamed luxury hung from her shoulders. She laughed at something Leo said, her hand brushing his arm, a casual, possessive touch. Emma's stomach twisted, but not from the baby. Her breath came too shallow, her chest tightening around a scream she couldn't release. She felt heat rising behind her eyes, but she wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. The hostess, a bright-faced college girl, led them toward a window booth, and Leo followed without noticing her. Emma's body screamed to disappear, to vanish into the kitchen and hide in the walk-in freezer until the world made sense again. But then she heard the bark of her manager. "Emma, table 7's ready for drinks. Move." Her body moved on instinct. She turned sharply, the tray wobbling in her grip, her shoes whispering against the floor as she glided, escaped, toward the bar. Her heart thundered so loudly she could barely hear the music overhead. But just as she reached the counter, her eyes flicked sideways and collided with his. The world shattered. Leo's face drained of color. The easy smile he had worn slipped away, replaced by something raw and startled. His lips parted, a breathless, disbelieving whisper escaping. "Emma?" She felt the air leave her lungs. For a fraction of a second, the entire restaurant, the noise, the people, the clatter, vanished. There was only his face. And the flash of shock, of recognition, of something else she couldn't name. His eyes dropped and landed on her stomach. Emma saw the moment it hit him. His body stiffened as if the world had punched the air from his chest. His lips moved, but no sound came. And then, the woman at his side turned, confusion in her voice. "Leo?" His gaze snapped away from Emma, and in that instant, something inside her cracked. Her grip on the tray slipped. The glass toppled, and with a deafening crash it shattered at her feet. The sound broke the spell. Heads turned, conversation stilled. The air thickened with the weight of 100 curious eyes. Emma's face burned, heat surging up her neck and into her ears. She felt the floor beneath her, cold, wet from spilled water, and the sharp sting of humiliation. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't look up. Not at the faces, not at him. A sharp voice sliced through the silence. "Is everything okay here?" The manager, of course. Emma's voice was like cracked glass. I'm sorry, I'll clean it up." But before she could kneel, a hand reached for her. His hand. "Emma." Her body reacted faster than her thoughts. She jerked away from his touch as if it burned, her voice cutting, low and sharp. "Don't." The single word stopped him cold. The manager, sensing tension, stepped between them. "Sir, I'll have another server take your order. Emma," he turned to her with a scowl, "clean up this mess, now." Emma didn't argue. She sank to her knees, ignoring the cold seep of water into her uniform, her hands shaken as she gathered the broken glass. Above her, she heard the woman's voice, light and questioning. "Leo, what's going on?" His answer came, halting and unsteady. "Nothing, just nothing. Nothing." Emma's chest seized. The glass bit into her palm and she barely felt it. By the time the floor was clear and the onlookers had returned to their meals, Emma's body felt hollowed out. Her hands stung from a fresh cut, thin, shallow, but enough to mark her skin. She barely noticed. From behind the counter, she felt his eyes on her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But her heart was a wrecking ball inside her chest. Her shift dragged on, but she felt every second like a weight around her neck. When the bill for Table 7 finally closed, and she saw them rise from their seats, relief and panic tangled inside her. But he didn't leave. Of course, he didn't. The moment his companion disappeared toward the restroom, she felt him approach. "Emma?" His voice, so familiar, too familiar, made her flinch. Her fingers curled into the edge of the counter. She didn't look at him. "Don't. Just don't." But Leo was never one to obey silence. "You're—" He paused, his voice tight. "You're pregnant." Emma's teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. "What gave it away?" she said, her tone cold and jagged. The silence between them buzzed with everything unsaid. "Is it?" His voice broke slightly on the question. He couldn't finish it. Her eyes, cold as stone, finally met his. "What do you think?" The color drained from his face. Emma felt the bitter satisfaction bloom in her chest, sharp and fleeting. "Congratulations," she said, her voice cutting. "You're going to be a father. Surprise." He stepped closer, his voice raw. "Emma, I—" But the woman's voice called from behind him, light and questioning. "Leo?" Emma's lips pressed into a thin line. Leo's head turned, his face tightening, and he said the word that broke something inside her. "She's just a waitress." The world seemed to fracture, every piece slicing her skin on the way down. Her heart stopped, and then it shattered. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma felt her throat burn, felt the heat of tears she refused to let fall. With a voice that could have frozen the air itself, she said, "That's right, just a waitress. And you," her eyes pierced through him, "are just a coward." His face twisted with something, pain, regret, but she didn't care. She was already walking away. And this time, she didn't look back. The night air outside the restaurant was crisp and sharp, each breath Emma took cutting against her throat. Her hands trembled as she pulled her coat tight around herself, but the cold wasn't the reason. It was him. His voice, his face, the weight of his presence, all of it was a storm she had barely weathered. And the words, "She's just a waitress." They rang in her head, hollow and cruel, each echo driving a fresh splinter into her chest. She had thought his leaving was the worst of it. The silence, the abandonment, the nights spent drowning in heartbreak. But no. The worst was seeing him again, and realizing he could still shatter her without even trying. Her belly, full and heavy beneath her coat, shifted with a kick. She paused, her breath catching. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, her voice soft but tight. "I'm okay. We're okay." The lie tasted bitter. Behind her, the restaurant door swung open with a chime. Footsteps, familiar, unmistakable, crunched on the frosted pavement. She stiffened, but didn't turn. "Emma." His voice, closer now, raw and uncertain. "Go away," she said, her voice brittle as ice. "Haven't you done enough?" But he didn't leave. "Please, just let me talk." Her fist clenched at her side. "You lost the right to talk to me months ago." "I know," he said, and something in his voice cracked. "I know, but—" He stumbled over the words. "Emma, I didn't know about the baby. If I had—" She turned then, her eyes flashing. "You would have stayed?" Her voice sliced through the cold, every word burning with hurt. "Don't lie to me, Leo. You didn't leave because you didn't know. You left because you didn't care." His face twisted in anguish. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" she snapped. "You walked out on me. You disappeared. And tonight you had the audacity to call me just a waitress." Regret darkened his eyes, and his voice dropped. "That's not. I didn't mean—" "But you said it," she cut in, her voice trembling. "And you know what? Maybe you're right. Maybe I am just a waitress, but you—" She stepped closer, her breath visible in the freezing air. "You're just a coward." His mouth opened, then closed, his throat working as if he wanted to say something, anything, but couldn't find the words. The silence stretched, cold and final. Emma's voice, when it came again, was quieter, tired. "Go back to your date, Leo. Go back to your perfect little life. And leave me out of it." The finality in her tone was a door slamming shut. Leo stood frozen, his hands helpless at his sides, his face carved with 1,000 things unsaid. But he didn't stop her as she turned and walked away. The apartment felt colder than the night outside. Emma dropped her keys on the counter, her hands still shaking. Her knees gave out, and she sank to the couch, her body folding in on itself. The baby, as if sensing her turmoil, pressed a small foot against her ribs. The tears came then, hot and fast, and she let them. She cried for the life they had dreamed of, for the man she had lost, and for the woman she used to be. But through the sobs, through the wreckage of her heart, something else flickered. Rage. A fire, small but searing. She would not let this break her. She couldn't. Not now. Not with this child. Their child, dependent on her. Her fingers curled into the fabric of the couch. "We don't need him," she whispered, her voice hoarse but firm. "We never did." And she meant it. The next morning, Emma woke with her face pressed to the cushion, her body aching from the awkward position. Her eyes felt swollen, her throat raw, but her heart burned with a new resolve. The world hadn't stopped. Neither would she. The shifts at the restaurant became a battle, and Emma fought them with everything she had. She moved faster, smiled harder, endured longer. She ignored the whispers, the stares, the lingering ache in her chest. But the weight of her body, of her exhaustion, was becoming impossible to ignore. She felt it in the heaviness of her limbs, in the way her breath shortened with every step. The baby was taking more from her now, demanding every ounce of her strength. And then, one evening, her body finally betrayed her. The dinner rush was at its peak, a whirlwind of orders and demands. Emma felt the heat climbing up her spine, her vision tightening at the edges. She reached for a pitcher, and the world tilted sideways. The floor rushed up to meet her, hard and unforgiving. A scream, someone's, rang through the restaurant. Voices swirled above her, distant and muffled, and then darkness. She woke to the sharp scent of antiseptic and the soft, rhythmic beep of monitors. The hospital room was dim, the only light coming from the monitors casting a pale glow against the walls. Panic hit first. Her hands flew to her belly. The soft, steady rhythm beneath her palm sent a wave of relief so powerful it nearly crushed her. The baby was still there. Still with her. The door creaked open, and a nurse appeared, her face warm but professional. "Good to see you awake, Miss Reed." Emma's voice was a whisper. "The baby?" The nurse's smile softened. "Still fighting, just like you. But you need rest. Your blood pressure was dangerously high. You collapsed from exhaustion." Emma's head sank back against the pillow, her body shaking from relief and fear. I can't. I have to work." The nurse's eyes turned gentle but firm. "No, you don't. Not now. Your baby needs you to stop." The words hit hard because she knew they were true. She had pushed herself too far. The price had been too high. The hospital released her with strict orders. Rest, no stress, no overexertion. But how? How could she rest when bills, rent, and survival waited for no one? Her hands trembled as she stared at the growing stack of envelopes on her kitchen table. Bills she couldn't pay, threats she couldn't ignore. A sharp knock at the door broke the silence. Her heart clenched. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, her breath hitched. Leo. His eyes swept over her, pale, exhausted, the hospital band still faint on her wrist. His face, carved with worry, softened with something that made her chest tighten. "I heard," he said simply, his voice low. "The hospital called. His throat worked. "I had to know you were okay." Her exhaustion, her fear, her anger, they all surged at once. "Why?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "So you could feel better about leaving me? About pretending I didn't exist?" His face twisted. "No, God, no. Emma, But she wasn't finished. "You don't get to show up now, Leo. You don't get to care when it's convenient." His eyes burned. "It's not about convenience. It's about—" He faltered, his voice breaking. "I was scared, Emma. Scared of failing you. Scared of being everything I swore I wouldn't be. And He closed his eyes briefly. "I ran. Because I thought that's what you'd be better off without." Her voice was a whisper, raw and broken. "You thought wrong." The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. Then, his voice soft but certain, "Let me help you." Emma's lips pressed tight. "I don't want your pity." "It's not pity," he said. "It's responsibility." Her voice trembled with the weight of months of suffering. "You lost the right to be responsible when you left." His hands, shaken, curled into fists at his sides. "I know, but I can't undo that. I can't fix what I broke. But I will be here. For you. For them." His voice dropped, raw and pleading. "Just let me." Emma's heart, fractured, bruised, quivered beneath his words. And she hated that somewhere, deep inside, a part of her still wanted to believe him. But belief had a price. And Leo hadn't paid it. Not yet. Her eyes, hollow and guarded, met his. "You want to help?" Her voice was steel over a breaking heart. "Then start by understanding this." Her hand covered her belly, protective and firm. "I don't trust you." His face cracked, but he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I know." When she closed the door, his shadow lingered on the other side. But this time, it did not feel like the end. It felt like the storm had only just begun. The days that followed felt strangely hollow, as though the storm had passed but left behind a landscape stripped of color. Emma moved through her life on autopilot, her body weary, but her mind unwilling to rest. The doctor's orders echoed in her head: rest, reduce stress, protect the baby, but reality, cold and unyielding, had little room for softness. The hospital bills arrived swiftly, followed by a notice from her landlord reminding her that the rent was overdue. The restaurant manager had offered her unpaid leave until she recovered, but unpaid meant a countdown to eviction. Emma sat at her kitchen table, the stack of envelopes before her a monument to her failures. She felt the baby stir, a soft roll beneath her ribs, and her hand moved instinctively to soothe the restless movement. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice tight. "I know we're running out of time." A knock at the door startled her, sharp and insistent. Her heart clenched. She wasn't expecting anyone. For a fleeting moment, panic took hold. She wiped her hands on her sweater, smoothed her hair back, and opened the door. "Leo." The sight of him made her stomach tighten with something sharp and complicated. He stood on her doorstep, a paper bag in one hand, his other clenched at his side as if to stop himself from reaching for her. His face, too familiar, too missed, was guarded, but his eyes burned with something raw. "I brought you dinner," he said, his voice soft, uncertain. "Figured you might not feel up to cooking." Emma's fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "You can't just show up," she said, her voice cold. "You think a bag of food makes up for months of nothing?" Leo's throat worked as he swallowed. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't. I wanted to help." Her body screamed at her to slam the door, to shut him out and shield herself from the chaos he brought. But her exhaustion was bone deep, and the scent of something warm and savory from the bag curled through the cold air. She hated herself for it, but she stepped aside. "Fine," she said stiffly, "but don't expect me to thank you." He entered cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace of the room. The apartment felt too small with him in it, the air too thick. He set the bag down on the counter and unpacked containers, the quiet sounds filling the silence between them. Emma sank heavily into a chair, her hand resting on her belly. She felt his eyes flick to the movement, then quickly away. He busied himself with the food, his jaw tight. "I paid the hospital," he said abruptly, his voice low. "The bills, they're covered." Her spine stiffened, the coldness returned in a wave. "You did what?" "You don't have to worry about them," he said quickly. "It's taken care of." Anger surged, sudden and hot. "You had no right," she snapped, her voice sharp. "You can't just throw money at this and think it fixes everything." Leo's shoulders tensed, but he didn't meet her eyes. "I know it doesn't fix anything," he said, his voice rough, "but it's something I can do, and you shouldn't have to choose between your health and your rent." Emma's hands curled into fists on the table. She hated the helplessness that tangled with her fury. "I didn't ask for your charity." His voice broke slightly, and he finally looked at her, something raw and pleading in his gaze. "It's not charity. It's my responsibility." The silence that followed was heavy and jagged. Emma felt her pulse pounding, her breath shallow. "You can't buy your way out of what you did, Leo," she said finally, her voice tight with unshed tears. "You left. You broke us. And you don't get to waltz back in with a check and think you've earned a place here." His face twisted, and his voice dropped, low and thick with something that sounded like regret. "I know. God, Emma, I know, but I swear to you, I'm not here to buy anything. I'm here because I can't." He paused, his hands pressing flat on the counter, his voice almost a whisper. "I can't live with what I've done, and I can't let you carry it all alone." The fight drained out of her as quickly as it had risen, leaving her hollow and shaking. She pressed a hand over her eyes, her voice cracking. "It's too late for apologies, Leo." He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost broken. "I know, but I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance to do something right." The weight of everything, the months of anger and heartbreak, of survival and solitude, pressed down until Emma thought she might shatter. She lowered her hand, her gaze meeting his, and in his eyes she saw the ruin of the man she had loved. She hated that it made her chest ache. Finally, she exhaled, the sound frayed and thin. "I don't trust you," she said, her voice a thread above breaking. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I know." The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope over something vast and unforgiving. Leo began to appear, not uninvited but not entirely welcome, at the edges of her life. He brought groceries without asking and left them on the counter, He fixed the leaky faucet that had driven her mad for weeks without a word. He called in favors and arranged for her prescriptions to be delivered. And, quietly, he stayed away from her space unless she allowed him in. Emma watched it all with wary eyes, waiting for the cracks to show, for the moment when he would revert to the man who had walked away. She didn't lower her guard, but she felt the exhaustion lighten fractionally, the weight shared if only a little. She told herself it meant nothing, that he was making amends out of guilt, and guilt was a fickle foundation. But it was hard to ignore the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, as though she was the center of something he had lost and didn't know how to find again. The first time he felt the baby move, it was an accident. Emma was on the couch, a hand on her belly as the baby pressed against her ribs with a firm, impatient kick. She winced, shifting uncomfortably, and Leo, who had been halfway to the kitchen, paused, his eyes catching the movement. "Are they?" he began softly, his voice unsure. She hesitated, then, without meeting his eyes, she took his hand and placed it carefully over the curve of her stomach. For a heartbeat, nothing. And then, a sudden, strong kick. Leo's breath caught. His fingers trembled slightly against her skin. "Oh," he said, his voice barely a whisper, and the single syllable carried a wealth of wonder and grief. Emma felt something crack in her chest at the rawness in his voice. She pulled her hand away quickly, her heart pounding. "Don't," she said hoarsely, "don't think this changes anything." He nodded, his throat working, but his hand lingered for a fraction of a second longer. "I know," he said, but his voice sounded like a promise. But the ghosts between them did not rest easily. The third night after that fragile moment, Emma woke from a nightmare. Leo's back turned, her screams swallowed by the cold emptiness he left behind. Her chest was tight, her breath shallow and fast. She sat up abruptly, her heart racing, the room swimming in shadows. The baby shifted, a soft reminder of the present, and her hand pressed over her stomach, seeking comfort. But the ache inside was deeper than fear. It was the bitter tang of abandonment, the knowledge that she had loved a man who had made her believe in forever and then vanished when forever became real. The sudden scrape of the front door broke the silence. Alarm jolted through her, and she reached for her phone. The lock clicked, and Leo's voice, soft but urgent, called into the dark. "Emma?" Her pulse skidded, confusion cutting through the haze. She flicked on the lamp, her voice sharp and wary. "What the hell are you doing here?" He appeared in the doorway, his hair tousled, his face tight with something that looked like panic. "The hospital," he said, his voice low and shaking. "They called me." Emma's brow furrowed. "What?" His hands, still trembling, dragged through his hair. "They said," his voice cracked, "they said you were admitted." Realization dawned, cold and sudden. "No," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "No, I wasn't. It's a mistake." But Leo was already closing the distance, his voice raw with the edges of something jagged. "I thought—" He stopped short, his chest heaving. "I thought I lost you." Emma stared at him, the fury that rose clashing violently with something else, something old and aching. "So you ran here," she said, her voice shaking, "because you thought you'd already lost me. But I've been here, Leo, alone, for months, and you chose to lose me long before tonight." His face so open, so exposed, shattered. "I know," he rasped, the words thick and weighted, "but I swear to you—" His voice broke. "I swear to you, Emma, I'm not going to lose you again." Emma's throat closed. "You don't get to promise me that," she whispered, her voice barely holding. Not after everything. The silence between them was a knife edge, poised and trembling. Then Leo's voice, hoarse and stripped bare, "Then let me prove it." Emma's heart, battered and bruised, screamed for her to slam the door again, to lock it, to seal herself from the man who had broken her once and could break her again. But her chest ached, and her heart had never stopped knowing his voice. She closed her eyes, her voice a thread above breaking. "One step, Leo." She opened her eyes and they burned. "And if you falter, if you run," her voice cracked, "we are done." Leo's throat worked. "I won't." Emma felt the weight of it, the risk, the terror, the unbearable hope. "Then step carefully," she said softly, "because I won't survive another fall." The winter wind scraped against the windows, carrying with it the muffled sounds of the city, distant traffic, the faint wail of a siren, and the occasional crunch of footsteps on frozen pavement. Inside the apartment, the warmth of the heater battled against the cold that seeped through every crack. The space felt both too large and suffocatingly small, filled with the ghosts of words spoken and unspoken. Emma sat on the couch, her hand resting on her belly, the slow, steady movement of the baby beneath her palm, the only thing tethering her to calm. She felt it again, a sharp nudge against her ribs, firm and insistent. The baby was restless tonight, as though sensing the storm brewing around them. Leo sat across from her, perched on the edge of the armchair, his hands clasped between his knees, his eyes heavy with something unreadable. He hadn't spoken in a while, hadn't tried to fill the silence with half-formed explanations or empty apologies. Perhaps he had learned that words now were too fragile to carry the weight of their ruin. His face, illuminated by the soft golden hue of the lamp, looked older than she remembered. The arrogance, the easy charm, both had been stripped away, leaving something raw and uncertain. Emma's voice, when it came, was soft but edged with steel. "You're still here," she said, the statement laced with wary observation. Leo's eyes lifted to hers, and the exhaustion there was matched only by the determination that burned beneath it. "I told you," he said simply, his voice roughened by the cracks of the past. "I'm not going anywhere." Emma's fingers flexed over the curve of her stomach, the old defenses rising, the familiar instinct to push him away, to shield herself from the inevitable hurt. "You say that now," she replied, her voice tight. "But you've said things before." Leo flinched, but he nodded. "I did," he admitted quietly. "And I failed you. I ran. I let fear—" He broke off, his voice unsteady before he drew a sharp breath and pressed on. "I can't undo that. I can't rewrite what I broke. But Emma," his voice lowered, rough with something fragile, "I don't want my child to grow up believing that running is what we do when things get hard, and I don't want you to face this alone anymore." Emma's chest tightened, her heart warring between the ache of the past and the whisper of something terrifyingly close to hope. Before she could form a reply, a sudden wave of pressure bloomed low in her abdomen. She inhaled sharply, her body going rigid. The movement startled the baby into a flurry of kicks, and her hand pressed instinctively against her belly. Leo's eyes sharpened instantly. "Emma?" His voice, tight with alarm, cut through the haze of discomfort. She forced a breath through her teeth, her jaw tight against the sudden ache. It's fine. Just a Braxton Hicks. Happens all the time." She tried for a dismissive tone, but the strain in her voice betrayed her. But the tension in her abdomen did not ease. Instead, it sharpened, a slow, building pain that stole the air from her lungs. She felt a cold trickle of fear seep through her bones. This wasn't the familiar, fleeting discomfort she had learned to endure. This was different. Her breath hitched and her fingers curled into the fabric of the couch. "Something's," she started, but the next wave of pain swallowed the words whole, and her body folded instinctively around her belly. Leo was at her side in an instant, his hands catching her shoulders. "Emma!" His voice, raw with panic, cut through the haze. She gasped, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "It's not. It's too early," she managed, her voice tight, broken. The world tilted, a blur of rushing movement and the cold shock of adrenaline. Emma barely registered Leo's arm around her as he half lifted, half carried her to the door, his voice urgent and frayed as he barked for their coats, for her shoes, for the keys. The car was a blur of headlights and freezing leather seats. Emma's breath came in shallow, rapid bursts, her hands clenching against the burning tightness that gripped her. Leo's voice, desperate and raw, called through the chaos, urging her to hold on, to stay with him, to just breathe. The hospital emerged through the darkness, a beacon of sterile, blinding light. Doors opened, hands pulled her from the car, a rush of voices, of urgency. The ceiling above her was too white, the lights too sharp. Preterm labor, 32 weeks, BP spiking. The voices blended together, cold, clinical. She felt Leo's hand, warm and shaking, tighten around hers. "I'm here," he said, his voice breaking. "Emma, I'm here." The pain crested and her voice tore from her throat, raw and sharp as glass. Then everything slipped sideways into darkness. The world returned in pieces. The steady, rhythmic beep of a monitor. The distant hum of voices beyond a closed door. The ache in her body, deep and bruising, a reminder of the battle fought within her. Her eyes opened to the muted glow of the hospital room. The walls, washed in soft, sterile tones, felt too large and too small all at once. She felt the absence first, a familiar, comforting fullness beneath her ribs, gone. Her breath faltered, her chest tightening with terror. Her hand, trembling, moved to her stomach, meeting only the bandage's whisper and the dull ache beneath. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No." The panic rose wild and uncontrollable. But then, a sound, soft, fragile, the rhythmic, steady hiss of a ventilator. Her eyes darted to the far side of the room, and there, in a small, glass-enclosed incubator, a tiny, impossibly small form lay curled in a nest of tubes and wires. The baby, her baby, fighting against the world they had barely entered. The sound that escaped her was broken, a sob from the depths of her soul. Her body tried to move, but the weight of her exhaustion pinned her down. A voice, thick with raw edges, broke through the fog. "Emma?" She turned, and there, Leo. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes dark hollows carved by anguish and sleepless hours. He stood at her bedside, his shoulders stiff, his hands trembling at his sides. He looked ruined. "Leo," her voice cracked, thick with everything, grief, terror, and the unbearable question. "The baby." He was already moving, his voice low, urgent but trembling. "They're alive," he rasped. "They—" His voice broke, and he swallowed against the fracture. "They're alive, Emma, but they're—" He paused, and his eyes, shattered and pleading, met hers. "They're fighting. Our little fighter." Her heart collapsed inward. She felt the tears spill, hot and unchecked. Her voice broke into sobs, her body shaking from the weight of it all. And Leo sank to his knees at her side, his forehead pressed to her hand, his body trembling against the storm. "I'm sorry," he choked, his voice wrecked. "I'm so sorry. I should have—" His voice failed, and the silence, heavy and broken, filled the space between them. Emma's fingers, weak but steady, closed around his hand. Her voice, fragile but unyielding, cut through the shattered pieces of them. "You don't get to fall apart," she said, her voice rough but certain. "Not now." Leo lifted his head, his eyes burning with grief and something else, something that could only be called resolve. "You fight," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "With me. For them." Leo's jaw clenched and the tears that broke from his eyes went unchecked. He nodded, his voice a whisper, raw, fractured, and absolute. "I will." The days bled into one another, each marked by the same rhythm, the hushed hum of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses' footsteps, and the steady mechanical hiss of the ventilator keeping their child tethered to life. The world outside the hospital existed only in fragments glimpsed through windows, slanting beams of winter sunlight, the glint of snow on bare tree branches, and the slow march of time that felt meaningless within these walls. Emma lived at the edge of every breath their baby took. Each beep of the monitors was a heartbeat in her chest, each fluctuation on the screen a tremor through her soul. She sat for hours beside the incubator, her hand pressed lightly against the glass, whispering stories and promises to the impossibly tiny life within. She marveled at the translucent skin, the fragile curve of fingers barely the length of her fingertip, and the flutter of impossibly delicate eyelashes. "You are so strong," she would say, her voice a thread of sound, "stronger than I ever knew we could be." Leo became a constant presence, quiet, unwavering, but never intrusive. He was there at dawn when the doctors made their rounds, listening intently, his jaw tight with tension. He was there at night, his large hands cradling Emma's when the fear became too much to carry alone. He never asked for forgiveness, never tried to explain his past choices. Instead, he showed up day after day, his grief and his love etched plainly in his every action. At first, Emma did not know what to make of him. She watched him, guarded and wary, waiting for the cracks to show, for his presence to falter under the weight of this trial. But it never did. He held their child's impossibly small hand through a layer of plastic and wept silently when a doctor cautiously used the word stable. He brought Emma coffee without asking if she wanted it, knowing that she would never leave the bedside long enough to get it herself. When exhaustion broke her and she dozed in the stiff hospital chair, she would wake to find Leo's jacket draped over her shoulders and his hand resting, warm and steady, over hers. But it was not easy. The strain of waiting, of helplessness, weighed on them both. There were days when the doctor's updates were clipped and cautious, and the words complications and setback turned the air to ice. Emma broke once, a raw, fractured sob shaking her as she gripped the edge of the incubator and whispered, "Please, don't leave me. Not you too." Leo, his voice tight with his own breaking, said softly behind her, "They won't. They're fighting, just like you." There were nights, too, when the hospital's sterile walls became too small and Emma's grief too large. "I hate this," she whispered one night, her voice shaking. "I hate the waiting. I hate the fear. I hate that I can't do anything but sit here and hope." She felt Leo's hand close over hers, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse. "I know, but we're here, and we're not leaving." The first time Emma was allowed to hold their child, it was as if the world had both stopped and begun again. The nurse helped her settle into the chair and then, carefully, so carefully, placed the impossibly small bundle against her chest. Emma's breath caught. Her heart, a fragile, breaking thing in her chest as the warmth of her child seeped through the thin hospital gown. The baby's heartbeat, faint and fluttering, thudded against her skin, a rhythm that felt like a promise. She closed her eyes, tears slipping free as she whispered, "Hello, my love. I've been waiting to meet you." Leo stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his eyes wet with emotion he could not contain. He did not speak. He couldn't. There were no words for this moment, only the shared, trembling awe of a miracle held close. Time passed, measured not in days, but in ounces gained, in the slow decrease of tubes and wires, and in the moments when the doctors began to use the word progress more often than complications. Their baby, once so fragile it felt like a whisper, grew stronger. Tiny fingers curled with surprising strength around Emma's pinky. Eyes, Leo's eyes, blinked up at her from beneath a soft haze of lashes. With every ounce gained, the walls around Emma's heart began to crack. She had kept them tall and fortified, built from pain and abandonment, from the unbearable ache of surviving alone. But Leo was there, always pressing his palms against the walls, not with force, but with patience. He never asked to be let in. He simply stayed, braving the cold winds of her anger, the sharp edges of her grief. And Emma, piece by piece, felt herself begin to thaw. The day they brought their child home, the world felt impossibly large and terrifying. Emma carried their baby, now strong enough to fill her arms with warmth and life, while Leo hovered close, his hands ready to catch them both if the ground dared to shift beneath their feet. The apartment, once a place of loneliness and heartbreak, felt different now. The air was filled with the soft warmth of new life, the quiet sighs of their child, the gentle creak of the rocking chair Leo had assembled without instructions, swearing under his breath for an hour before finally admitting defeat and looking up a tutorial. It was not a sudden thing, the healing. Emma did not wake up one morning and find that the pain was gone, that her heart no longer carried the weight of Leo's betrayal. There were still nights when she lay awake, the memory of his absence a cold shadow against her spine. There were still days when she questioned whether she could ever truly trust him not to break her again. But then there were mornings. Mornings when she would wake to find him dozing on the couch, their child cradled against his chest, his large hands so careful and tender it made her chest ache. Mornings when he would stumble into the kitchen, bleary-eyed from a night spent walking the floor with a crying baby, and smile at her with something so real, so raw, that she felt it crack through her ribs and wrap around her heart. And then there was the night she broke. Not from anger, but from something deeper and older. She stood in the doorway, watching Leo as he rocked their child, his voice low and warm in the hush of the room. And something inside her, something she had held together with grief and iron, shattered. "I hated you," she said, her voice raw and trembling. "I hated you so much for leaving me." Leo's voice, when it came, was a whisper over the child's soft breaths. "I know." Her hands trembled at her sides. "You broke me, Leo." His shoulders stiffened, his head bowing as though the weight of those words had struck him physically. "I know," he said, and his voice cracked, "and I live with that every day." Her throat closed, her breath hitching. "But you stayed," she whispered. "You stayed when I gave you every reason not to." Leo turned then, his eyes meeting hers, dark and shining and stripped bare of every defense. "I'm never leaving again," he said, his voice a vow carved from everything he had left. "Not ever." The silence that followed was thick and trembling. And then, Emma's body broke forward, her knees colliding with his, her head pressing into his chest as the sobs finally escaped her. His arms closed around her, strong and certain, their child safe between them, and for the first time in what felt like forever. Emma let herself fall, and knew, with a certainty that shook her to her bones, that he would catch her. The morning broke soft and golden, the pale sunlight casting a warm glow across the bedroom. The house, once filled with the echoes of loneliness, now pulsed with life. The faint shuffle of tiny limbs against a crib sheet, the occasional sleepy murmur, and the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair where Emma often sat during the night. The air smelled of fresh coffee and something faintly sweet, hints of vanilla from the candle Leo had lit in the kitchen, though he would never admit he liked the soft scents Emma favored. Emma stood by the window, her arms folded across her chest, her gaze distant as she watched the winter retreat in the face of spring. The trees, once skeletal and shivering, had begun to bud, soft green pushing against the remnants of cold. The world was waking. And so, she felt, was she. Behind her, a soft, cooing sound broke the hush. Emma turned, her heart swelling as her eyes met the crib's familiar sight. Her baby, their baby, stretching tiny fingers into the air, their face scrunching with the slow effort of waking. She crossed the room with a practiced ease, her body still remembering the ache of sleepless nights, though they had grown fewer. She lifted the small, warm bundle into her arms, pressing her lips to the downy head. "Good morning, my little miracle," she whispered, her voice laced with a tenderness so deep it almost broke her. A voice, soft and familiar, answered from the doorway. "You both look perfect like that." Emma glanced up to find Leo leaning against the frame, his arms crossed, his expression one she had come to know well, a look of awe and something more, something quieter and older. She felt the warmth of it wrap around her, but it did not erase the careful space that still lingered between them, the fragile bridge they had built from the wreckage of their past. She lowered her gaze, adjusting the baby's blanket. "Did you sleep?" Leo's lips twitched in a small, self-deprecating smile. "A little. Hard to stay in bed when I hear you two up." Emma's voice was soft but laced with gentle reproach. "You need to rest. You've been running on fumes." His smile softened, his eyes flickering to the child nestled against her chest. "I don't mind losing sleep for this." Emma's throat tightened, and she felt the familiar tension that always came with these moments, the ache of knowing how far they had come and how much still stood between them. She cleared her throat, her voice light but with an edge of vulnerability. "Come here then, since you're already up." Leo's face softened further, something warm sparking in his eyes, and he moved to her side. She passed the baby into his waiting arms, and the sight, as always, tugged something deep inside her. His broad hands cradling something so impossibly small, his expression one of such careful reverence that it stole her breath. The baby gurgled, one tiny fist reaching up toward Leo's chin, and his face lit with a rare, boyish grin. "Look at you, already taken after your mom, strong and full of attitude." Emma huffed a soft laugh, folding her arms, but there was no masking the glint of affection in her eyes. "Oh, they get the attitude from you, no question." Leo chuckled low, his gaze never leaving the tiny face in his hands. "Well," he said softly, his voice dipping into something rougher, something raw, "let's hope they get your heart. God knows it's stronger than mine." The words landed with a weight that stilled the air between them. Emma felt it, the way his voice cracked at the edges, the honesty laid bare without defense or pretense. Her arms dropped to her sides, and for a long, breathless moment, there was only the quiet, a space between them where old wounds and new hopes collided. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly they were both there, their shoulders brushing as they stood side by side, their child the bridge between them. Leo's voice, rough and thick, broke the silence. "Emma." He stopped, as if searching for footing on uneven ground. I know you're still figuring out if you can trust me, and I don't blame you. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it. But what I feel, what I know, is that I love you. I never stopped. And if you'll let me, I want to build something with you. Not from the ashes, but from the roots. From here, from us." Emma's chest felt too tight, her heart too full, and her voice, when it came, was soft but certain. "Leo." She turned then, her eyes meeting his, and he saw it. Everything. The fear, the hope, the love so deeply buried but still alive. She let out a breath, slow and trembling. "You're right. I don't know if I can trust you completely, but—" She paused, her hand reaching, not for his, but for their child's. "But I want to, and that's more than I thought I could feel again." Leo's throat bobbed, his voice nearly breaking. "That's enough for me." Emma's lips, soft with the ghost of a smile, answered him. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere." The spring came in slowly, but with it, the promise of new things, long walks with the stroller, soft afternoons filled with laughter and the chaos of parenthood, and quiet evenings where the baby slept between them and the air was warm with possibility. The past, with all its shadows, did not vanish. But it softened, its sharp edges dulled by the steady, patient work of two people who had chosen, again and again, to stay. And in the heart of it all, their child grew, strong and bright, a beacon of everything they had fought for. On one golden evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned with the colors of a new day's end, Emma watched Leo holding their child, his face lit with a joy so pure it felt sacred. She felt her heart stir, and for the first time in a long time she realized this wasn't a second chance. It was the only chance that had ever mattered, a chance they had chosen, together. And it was everything. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Share this video with your friends and family who would enjoy this story. And while you're here, check out our other videos for more heartfelt stories. See you in the next one.